In war, there are jobs considered less dangerous than others. Flying an unarmed transport plane is one of them. A C-47 Dakota carries no weapons, no armor, no way to fight back against anything shooting at it from the ground or the air. Its entire defense is altitude, speed, and staying as far away as possible from wherever the actual fighting is happening. That's the rule every transport crew flying in Korea understands by late November of 1950, whether they're American, British, or any of the other nations contributing aircraft to the war effort. You fly cargo. You fly wounded men out of rear area airstrips. You fly nowhere near the front line itself, because the entire logic of what makes a transport crew useful depends on staying alive long enough to keep flying. This rule exists for good reason. Transport aircraft are slow, unarmored, and represent an enormous investment of trained aircrew that no air force can afford to lose recklessly. Doctrine across every UN air component in Korea reflects this. Keep the transports back. Let fighters and bombers handle anything close to enemy contact. It's not cowardice, it's basic operational logic. The same logic that's kept transport crews alive across theaters going back to the Second World War. On November 27, 1950, that rule stops applying to anyone flying transport aircraft in Korea. Chinese forces launch a massive offensive around a frozen lake in North Korea called the Chosin Reservoir, catching X-Corps, centered on the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division and a detachment of British Royal Marines in a rapidly closing encirclement. The broader Chosin campaign involves far more than a single isolated pocket. Multiple positions across the reservoir area come under simultaneous attack, all of it in temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero, cold severe enough to freeze weapons solid and turn untreated wounds lethal within hours. At Hagaru-ri specifically, the position that becomes the focus of the airlift, UN forces hold the surrounding high ground, but there's no way out on the ground. The only road south is cut, blocked by Chinese positions dug into the hills on either side of the route. Getting supplies in and casualties out becomes a critical logistics problem with only one realistic solution left. The air. Into that unprecedented situation flies a flight of unarmed transport planes that by any reasonable measure shouldn't even be fully operational in Korea yet. A Greek flight, barely finished with the long journey from Athens, about to fly directly into the worst 2 weeks of the entire war, with far less preparation than any air force would normally consider the bare minimum before sending a crew into combat. The Royal Hellenic Air Force's 13th transport flight departs Elefsis Air Base outside Athens on November 11, 1950, 7 C-47 Dakota aircraft and 67 officers and men on a route that reads almost like a world tour under different circumstances. Across Saudi Arabia, across Pakistan, across India, across Thailand, down through southern China, across the Philippines, finally reaching the Far East Theater after a journey covering thousands of miles through multiple climate zones in aircraft never designed for this kind of extended overwater and overland transit. Most of the crews making this journey are veterans already, and their experience matters enormously for what's about to happen to them. Many flew through the Mediterranean and Middle East campaigns of the Second World War, learning combat flying against a determined, well-equipped enemy in difficult terrain. More recently, nearly all of them flew through Greece's own brutal civil war against communist insurgents, a conflict that had only just ended the previous year, fought largely over mountainous terrain, not entirely unlike what awaits them in Korea. These aren't green pilots taking their first operational flights. They're experienced airmen, but experienced in a different war, on different terrain, and about to discover that none of that experience fully prepares anyone for what a Korean winter combined with a massive Chinese offensive actually looks like from inside an unarmed cockpit. They arrive in the Far East Theater in the first days of December 1950, attached to a U.S. Air Force troop carrier unit operating out of Daegu in South Korea. The flight worked alongside American transport squadrons in the region, though the precise unit chain of command from this early period isn't fully nailed down in the sources available. Under normal circumstances, doctrine for any newly arrived flight calls for a period of familiarization operations, learning the specific terrain features of the theater, learning local weather patterns, which in Korea during winter can shift violently and without much warning, learning the operational procedures, radio protocols, and coordination systems of a war they've technically just joined but haven't yet actually flown in. The Chinese offensive unfolding around the Chosin Reservoir compresses that entire introduction to almost nothing. The Greek flight has been in the Far East Theater for only a matter of days, most of that time spent simply getting aircraft serviced and crews briefed on basic operational procedures before they're called into their first combat mission of the war. There is no gradual introduction to combat flying in Korea for this unit. There's a crisis unfolding hundreds of miles north. Thousands of trapped and wounded men who need aircraft immediately, and a Greek flight that happens to be available, regardless of how little time they've actually had to prepare. The pilots making that journey now face an abrupt introduction to combat. What the Greek crews are told at their briefing on Korea's northeast coast is stripped down to only the essentials anyone has time to communicate. Land on the northeast coast of the Korean peninsula, a little past the 42nd parallel. From there, orders for the evacuation of a village called Hagaru-ri, where about 1,000 wounded Marines are waiting for a rescue that has to come from the sky because nothing on the ground can reach them in time, and because the alternative to air evacuation is leaving those men in an increasingly desperate situation as the cold and the fighting continue. The Marines trapped around Hagaru-ri have accomplished something remarkable in the days before the Greek flight even arrives in theater. With no proper airfield anywhere near their position and no time to build one under normal conditions, combat engineers have carved a landing strip roughly 2,200 feet long directly out of the frozen ground, working under intermittent enemy fire, working in temperatures that make metal tools nearly impossible to hold onto for more than a few minutes at a time, working with equipment never designed for this kind of emergency construction. The result is rough, uneven, frozen and slippery in patches, nothing close to what any pilot would consider an acceptable runway under peacetime standards. It's also the only thing standing between roughly 1,000 wounded men and a battle that a Korean winter and a massive Chinese force, numbering close to 120,000 troops by most accounts, with additional North Korean units factored into some overall totals for the region, seem determined to make sure none of them survive. Early December 1950. After hours of preparation, loading their aircraft with supplies and ammunition destined for the trapped forces at Hagaru-ri, and being issued heavy winter clothing that most of them have never needed before in their flying careers, the Greek crews take off. Several of the flight's C-47s assigned to the Hagaru-ri evacuation runs during this operation, crossing the eastern coast of the Korean peninsula, flying north over the Sea of Japan toward a battle none of them have any real frame of reference for. The flight itself takes them over terrain neither the crews nor their aircraft were built to operate in for extended periods. Mountain passes that funnel wind unpredictably. Sub-zero temperatures that make engines struggle to maintain proper operating conditions and cause hydraulic systems to stiffen in ways that make aircraft handling noticeably less responsive than normal. And below them, spread across the hills surrounding Hagaru-ri, Chinese positions that have had days now to dig in, to register their fire on exactly the kind of low, slow approach these unarmed transport aircraft are forced to make on final descent. There's no way to land quietly or safely on a 2,200-foot strip of frozen, uneven dirt in the middle of an active siege, and the Greek crews discover this immediately. Aircraft coming into Hagaru-ri, American and Greek alike, come under small arms fire on the approach, fire coming from Chinese positions in the surrounding hills that have clear lines of sight onto the final approach path. Aircraft taking off, now loaded with wounded men who can't defend themselves and crews who have no weapons to defend them with either, take fire again on the way out, often at the exact moment the aircraft is slowest and most vulnerable, climbing away from the strip at minimal airspeed. Multiple aircraft involved in the broader airlift, Greek and American, sustain hits from this ground fire over the course of the operation. Picture what this actually means for the men on the ground waiting for these aircraft to arrive. About 1,000 wounded Marines at Hagaru-ri, casualties accumulated across days of fighting in conditions that turn even minor untreated wounds into a genuine race against frostbite and infection as much as against continued enemy action. Every single C-47 that successfully lands on that strip and takes off again is, for the specific men loaded onto it during that run, a critical link in getting them out of North Korea at all. There is no margin here, no acceptable failure rate, only aircraft that either complete their runs or don't. The Greek crews fly multiple runs into Hagaru-ri over these days, the same repeated cycle each time. Approach under fire. Land on an uneven, slippery strip that offers almost no room for pilot error. Load wounded as quickly as physically possible, while ground crews and medical personnel work in freezing conditions to get stretcher cases aboard. Take off again, climbing away from the strip while still within range of the surrounding Chinese positions, hoping this particular departure doesn't end differently than the last one did. Accounts of the operation describe wounded American servicemen expressing genuine surprise at finding themselves being evacuated by Greek air crews rather than American ones, a detail that captures how little most of the men on the ground knew about which nations were contributing forces to the broader UN effort in Korea. Other wounded men, according to accounts of the fighting that led to their evacuation, describe having been badly outnumbered on the ground in the days before reaching the airstrip, uncertain even now how their units managed to hold on long enough to be pulled out at all. This is what the operation actually looks like, hour after hour, run after run, day after day. Not one single dramatic rescue captured in a single moment, but dozens of these runs repeated under fire, in temperatures that make every mechanical system on these aircraft and every human system in these crews' bodies fight against them at the same time. The flights to Hagaru-ri continue like this into early December 1950, each individual run carrying its own version of essentially the same story. Wounded men being carried out by pilots and crews who less than a month earlier were still stationed in Greece, halfway around the world from a war most of them had barely had time to properly study before being thrown directly into one of its worst battles. Somewhere out there is a family who will someday learn that a grandfather, a great uncle, someone they never got the chance to properly ask about any of this while he was still alive was one of the wounded men pulled off that frozen airstrip by a Greek Dakota crew he never expected to see in his entire life. These stories have a genuine way of resurfacing generations later. A grandchild finding an old letter tucked into a drawer, an old photograph nobody in the family could previously identify, a name someone finally has the resources and the curiosity to actually look into. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. There's plenty more sitting in the archives, verified and waiting to be told properly. That's really the whole channel. By the time the Chosin evacuation operation concludes, the 13th Hellenic Air Force flight and the American squadrons flying alongside it help move approximately 1,000 wounded Marines out of Hagaru-ri and to relative safety, part of a larger force that will go on to fight its way south to the port of Hungnam and eventual evacuation from North Korea entirely, in what becomes one of the most difficult fighting withdrawals of the entire war. The broader Chosin Reservoir campaign remains one of the single most brutal engagements of the Korean War by any measure, but the airlift out of Hagaru-ri stands as one of the operation's genuine, unambiguous successes, a critical logistics and evacuation effort that worked precisely when the alternative would have meant losing far more men to cold, untreated wounds and an enemy that had them surrounded on nearly every side. The United States government formally recognizes what the 13th Flight accomplished during this specific operation. In the months that follow, the unit receives a U.S. Presidential Unit citation specifically for its role evacuating wounded Marines from the Chosin Reservoir in December of 1950, one of the earliest and most significant honors earned by any element of the entire Greek expeditionary force across the whole war. It's a distinction earned during the first weeks the unit was even present in the theater, flown by crews who had barely finished unpacking their equipment before being sent directly into one of the single worst battles of the Korean War. Without the standard preparation period any of them would have reasonably expected before facing that kind of combat. The 13th Hellenic Air Force flight continues operating in Korea for years after the Chosin operation concludes, flying out of Kimpo Air Base from May 1951 onward as the war settles into its long, grinding middle years. Across the entire conflict, the flight eventually logs 2,916 total missions and nearly 14,000 flight hours, numbers that reflect not one dramatic rescue, but years of sustained, largely unglamorous transport work carried out under conditions that never fully stopped being dangerous. Over that same span, the flight evacuates more than 9,000 wounded in total, delivers tens of thousands of passengers, and moves enormous quantities of supplies and material across a war zone that never offered any guarantee of safe passage for unarmed aircraft. It pays a real, documented cost for this work. 12 officers, non-commissioned officers, and Air Force cadres are killed in action over the course of the war, and 4 of the 9 aircraft eventually allocated to the unit are lost entirely. The flight doesn't withdraw from Korea until May 1955, nearly 2 full years after the armistice formally ends the fighting. Its remaining aircraft finally returning to Greece on May 23rd of that year, more than 4.5 years after 7 C-47s first took off from Elefsis Air Base on a route that carried them across 3 continents to reach a war most of the men aboard those aircraft had barely had time to properly prepare for before they found themselves in the middle of it. The pilots and crews who flew those Hagaru-ri missions in early December of 1950 carried out something that doesn't need embellishment or dramatization to feel genuinely remarkable. Men who had been present in the Far East Theater for only a matter of days flying unarmed transport aircraft they'd had almost no time to properly test under actual Korean winter conditions, into an active siege surrounded by a massive enemy force to bring out wounded men who had every reasonable expectation that their rescue would look and sound American, and instead found themselves being carried to safety by voices speaking a language most of them had likely never heard before in their lives. This channel exists to take official citation records, unit histories, and documented accounts of operations like this one, and turn them into a story you can genuinely sit with rather than skim past. If that mattered to you today, subscribe and hit that like button. That's honestly how we keep doing this work, and there's plenty more of it still sitting in the archives. Thank you for giving the crews of the 13th Flight story the attention it earned. Nearly 75 years later, what it means to fly directly toward danger for strangers who don't even share your language is the kind of thing worth remembering properly.